A former NBA player with a promising future, Keith Appling had it all: talent, fame, and hometown pride. But in Detroit, a heated argument with his older relative, Clyde Edmonds, turned deadly. What drove this once celebrated athlete from the spotlight to a life sentence behind bars? In the city of Detroit, Michigan, a name once celebrated on basketball courts would soon become the focus of a tragic story that shocked fans and devastated a family. Keith Appling was born and raised in Detroit, a city that takes pride in its homegrown talent and resilience. He had all the qualities that promised a bright future: athletic skill, determination, and discipline. As a young man, Appling attended Pershing High School, where his basketball abilities set him apart early. He led his team to a state championship, and his name began to appear in headlines across Michigan. By the time he reached Michigan State University, he had become one of the top guards in the college game, playing under Coach Tom Izzo. His career at MSU between 2010 and 2014 earned him respect, recognition, and admiration. To his community, he wasn't just another player. He was proof that hard work and focus could lift someone out of Detroit's challenges. After college, Appling went undrafted in the NBA, but still managed to make his way into professional basketball. He signed short-term contracts, including time with the Orlando Magic and their G League affiliate teams. For a while, it looked like his persistence was paying off. But the NBA dream didn't last. The opportunities slowed, and Appling began to drift away from the stability basketball had once given him. By his late 20s, the fame and structure that used to define him had faded. What replaced them was uncertainty, frustration, and personal trouble. Detroit has always been a place of contradictions: grit and beauty, promise and struggle. For someone like Appling, who had risen from its neighborhoods, the fall was particularly hard. Without the guidance of coaches or the structure of a sport, he faced a reality that many former athletes encounter: life after the spotlight. His name still carried weight, but the direction in his life had become blurred. Friends and acquaintances noticed he wasn't the same focused player they had once known. The pressure of lost potential and the memories of what might have been weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, one of the people in his life who had always been there for him was his older relative, Clyde Edmonds. Clyde was 66 years old, a steady, familiar presence in the family. He lived on the west side of Detroit and had earned a reputation as someone dependable, calm, and level-headed. He had seen many in his family go through challenges, but he remained patient and grounded. Clyde and Keith had known each other all their lives, family ties that went back decades. To neighbors, they seemed like family who got along, though like many families, they sometimes had disagreements. In May 2021, a series of small frustrations and long-buried tensions would lead to a single afternoon that ended in tragedy. That day, Appling visited Clyde at his home in Detroit. It was supposed to be an ordinary visit, but a handgun became the center of a heated argument. The details of what started the argument are not fully clear, but what is certain is that emotions were already tense before things got out of hand. People close to the case later said the two men disagreed over who owned the gun or who should handle it. What began as a discussion quickly turned personal. Voices rose, accusations were exchanged, and pride took control. The moment was brief, but it changed everything. Witnesses described it as sudden, a sharp escalation that no one could stop. Keith, overwhelmed by anger, pulled out the gun and fired multiple shots at Clyde. The sound echoed through the neighborhood. When it was over, Clyde Edmonds, the 66-year-old relative who had been part of his life since childhood, was gone. Appling didn't stay. Shock and fear took over, and he fled the scene. The once promising athlete, who had played under bright arena lights, was now on the run through the streets of the city he had once represented. In the hours that followed, police officers arrived, securing the area and interviewing witnesses. News spread quickly. Detroit police had identified a suspect, and it wasn't just anyone. It was Keith Appling, the former Michigan State basketball star. The story hit the media fast. Local outlets reported it first, followed by national sports platforms. For fans who remembered his college years, it felt unreal. The same young man who once wore the green and white MSU jersey and talked about discipline and leadership was now wanted for murder. Detroit police released a brief statement confirming they were searching for Appling in connection with the fatal shooting of his relative. For the next few days, Keith's whereabouts were uncertain. He had help from his girlfriend, Natalie Bannister, who reportedly assisted him after the shooting. She helped him leave Detroit and avoid immediate arrest, though her involvement would later draw legal consequences of her own. Together, they tried to stay out of sight while authorities searched statewide. The hunt for Appling involved multiple agencies, including the Wayne County authorities and state police. His image circulated across the news, showing the face of a man who once symbolized determination, now clouded by despair. The public followed the updates closely. Many in Michigan had rooted for him over the years. Now they watched in disbelief as he became the subject of a homicide investigation. Several days after the shooting, law enforcement finally caught up with Appling. He was found and arrested in Chelsea, Michigan, a small city about an hour west of Detroit in Washtenaw County. Police confirmed that he had been taken into custody without incident. His arrest ended the manhunt, but began the long and painful process of uncovering how this tragedy unfolded. When word of the arrest spread, reactions varied. Some felt sympathy for a young man who had clearly lost control, while others were filled with anger and confusion. How could someone with so much potential, who had been given opportunities so few receive, come to this point? Reporters revisited his past achievements, showing clips from his college days and interviews from when he was a rising star. The contrast was striking. For Clyde Edmonds' family, grief overshadowed everything. They had lost a father figure, a relative, and a man known for his calm and care. His death was senseless, and the fact that it came from someone within the family made it harder to bear. By the time of the arrest, it was clear that this was not just another crime in Detroit. It was a deeply personal tragedy. The case of Keith Appling wasn't about gangs, robbery, or strangers. It was about family, anger, and the consequences of one irreversible decision. As Keith sat in a Michigan jail awaiting trial, his life had shifted completely. The applause from arenas was gone. The cheers of fans had been replaced by the silence of a cell. What had started as an argument between two relatives had ended with a man dead and another's future destroyed. The story of Keith Appling and Clyde Edmonds had already drawn national attention by the end of 2021, but the legal process was just beginning. For investigators, the focus turned to gathering evidence, reconstructing the argument, and understanding the moments leading up to the shooting. For the families involved, it was about facing what could never be undone. The case showed, in painful clarity, how quickly a life can unravel. Fame and success could not shield anyone from anger, pride, or poor judgment. In Detroit, where both men's lives had begun, the community watched the story unfold with sadness and disbelief. It was a reminder that tragedy can strike even those who seem to have everything under control. After his arrest in Chelsea, Michigan, Keith Appling was taken into custody and brought back to Detroit to face charges. The once promising athlete who had been celebrated across the state now appeared in orange jail clothing, his wrists bound, his face empty of the confidence that once defined him on the court. News cameras captured every moment, the escort by police, the tight security, and the quiet tension as reporters called out questions he didn't answer. For many watching, it felt surreal. They had seen him rise from Detroit playgrounds to the bright lights of college basketball, and now he was entering a courtroom accused of killing his own relative. The investigation moved quickly after his arrest. Detectives from Wayne County worked closely with local law enforcement to piece together the timeline of that deadly afternoon in May 2021. They spoke to neighbors who had heard the gunshots, family members who knew about the argument, and people who had seen Appling in the hours after the shooting. Every new detail confirmed the same story. The fight had been personal and fueled by anger. What made it so difficult for those close to both men was that it hadn't been a long-standing feud or something planned. It was a moment of rage that ended in irreversible loss. Clyde Edmonds' home became a key part of the investigation. Forensics teams collected evidence, mapping out where the shots were fired and how the confrontation might have unfolded. Investigators believe the argument over the handgun turned physical, leading to multiple shots that killed Clyde almost instantly. When police arrived, the scene told a clear story of chaos and finality. One man's anger, another man's life cut short. Meanwhile, Appling's girlfriend, Natalie Bannister, also faced legal trouble. Authorities alleged that she helped him leave the scene and later attempted to conceal the weapon used in the crime. Though her role wasn't as direct, prosecutors treated her actions seriously, emphasizing that helping a fugitive, even a loved one, was still a crime. Her arrest showed that this tragedy had stretched far beyond one act of violence. It had now pulled on others, leaving a ripple effect across multiple lives. In Detroit, the story drew heavy media attention. Local channels followed every update, and national sports outlets revisited Appling's career highlights, contrasting the young athlete's potential with the gravity of his charges. Former teammates and coaches expressed sadness and shock. Tom Izzo, his coach for Michigan State, called it heartbreaking, describing Appling as someone who had once been a leader and a fighter on the court. Fans who had followed his college journey struggled to understand how a disciplined player could reach this point. Appling's early court appearances were brief but emotional. Each time he stood before the judge, cameras filled the courtroom. He was formally charged with second-degree murder, felony firearm possession, and related counts. The seriousness of the charges left little doubt about the road ahead. His defense attorney requested time to review the evidence and discuss possible options, while prosecutors made it clear they intended to pursue justice for Clyde Edmonds. For the Edmonds family, every hearing was a painful reminder of what had happened. They sat in the courtroom, watching the man who had taken Clyde's life, knowing he was also their relative. The mix of grief and disbelief was heavy. Losing a family member is always hard, but losing one at the hands of another family member adds a layer of confusion and heartbreak that few can comprehend. As the months passed, Appling remained in custody. His life had narrowed to the walls of a detention center, far from the arenas and bright lights he once knew. He spent his days waiting for court dates, waiting for decisions, waiting to understand what his future might become. Reports from inside described him as quiet and withdrawn. He rarely spoke to other inmates, often keeping to himself, a man haunted by the weight of a single decision. During this time, prosecutors built a strong case. They had eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, and Appling's own actions after the shooting, which showed intent to flee. The combination painted a grim picture. Legal experts following the case noted that second-degree murder charges in Michigan carried a heavy sentence, anywhere from 15 years to life, depending on the circumstances. The additional firearm charge meant extra time, with state law requiring consecutive sentences for gun-related offenses. Despite his silence, the emotional toll was visible. When Appling appeared for later hearings, he looked smaller, more fragile, as if the reality of what he had done was settling in. Friends who had once cheered for him described feeling torn, sympathy for his fall, but sorrow for the life he had taken. Detroit's basketball community, once proud of their local star, now discussed him in the past tense, as if his career had ended long before the shooting. Meanwhile, the community around Clyde Edmonds continued to honor his memory. Neighbors remembered him as a man who didn't cause trouble, someone dependable who always had a kind word. They organized small vigils in his name, lighting candles outside his home and speaking about peace and forgiveness. For them, justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about acknowledgement that a good man's life had value and that his death would not be forgotten. The case moved through 2022 slowly but steadily. Hearings were delayed, as they often are, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Appling's defense team discussed possible plea agreements with prosecutors, exploring ways to avoid a lengthy trial that would reopen wounds for everyone involved. These discussions were quiet, but insiders hinted that a plea might be the best outcome given the overwhelming evidence. While the legal system worked through its process, the broader conversation around Appling's story deepened. Commentators pointed out how common it was for former athletes to struggle after their careers ended, especially when their identity had been tied to sports for so long. For Appling, basketball wasn't just a job. It had been his entire world. When that world collapsed, he seemed to lose his sense of control. That didn't excuse what happened, but it helped explain the pressure, anger, and instability that led to the fatal encounter. By late 2022, the courtroom proceedings were nearing a conclusion. Every new date brought the case closer to a decision. For both families, it was a period of waiting. One side mourning a life lost, the other facing the prospect of a long prison term for someone they once loved and admired. In these final months before the conclusion, the emotional distance between who Keith Appling had been and who he had become grew even wider. He was no longer the college star from Michigan State or the young athlete chasing his NBA dream. He was a man facing the full weight of his actions, his reputation reduced to headlines and case numbers. As the new year approached, Appling's lawyers informed the court that their client was prepared to make a decision. After nearly 2 years in custody and countless court appearances, the case of Keith Appling versus the state of Michigan was finally ready to reach its final stage. The courtroom would soon hear his admission, and with it, the closing chapter of a story that had begun with promise and ended in tragedy. The courtroom was quiet on the day Keith Appling finally spoke. Nearly 2 years had passed since the afternoon in May 2021 when he shot his older relative, Clyde Edmonds, during an argument that turned deadly. The case had moved through the court slowly, each hearing drawing attention from both the media and the Detroit community that once celebrated Appling as a hometown hero. Now in early 2023, the story that began with hope and descended into violence was reaching its conclusion. Appling stood before the judge in Wayne County Circuit Court, his voice low and steady as he entered his plea. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and an additional firearm charge, admitting his role in the killing of his 66-year-old relative. There were no excuses, no dramatic outburst, just a man acknowledging the damage he had done. For the first time, he publicly accepted that he was responsible for ending a life, one that belonged to a man who had once been part of his family. The courtroom listened in silence as the details of his crime were read out. The moment marked the end of a legal process, but also confirmed a personal tragedy that had changed multiple lives forever. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors described the events leading up to the murder and the chaos that followed. They emphasized how an argument over a handgun, a simple avoidable disagreement, had escalated into fatal violence. They spoke about Clyde Edmonds' life, the kind of person he was, and the void his death left behind. For the Edmonds family, those words were painful but necessary. They wanted the court to remember that Clyde was more than a name in a case file. He was a real person who had worked hard, cared for his family, and deserved more than to be remembered as a victim of anger. The defense took a different tone. They didn't try to deny what happened. They focused on Keith's remorse and his collapse after losing his basketball career. His attorney spoke about the pressures that followed him after his time in professional sports ended, the loss of purpose, the isolation, and the gradual decline into frustration and instability. They asked the court to consider that Appling had not acted out of cold intent, but out of uncontrolled emotion, a split-second decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. When it was his turn to speak, Keith Appling faced the judge and the family members sitting behind the prosecutor's table. His words were quiet but direct. He said he was sorry for what he had done and for the pain he had caused. He admitted that no sentence, no apology, could bring back Clyde Edmonds or undo the damage. He said he would live every day knowing that he had taken a man's life, someone who had once been there for him. It wasn't a long speech, but it was sincere, and for those listening, it was clear that the reality of his actions had finally settled in. The judge then delivered the sentence, 18 to 40 years in prison for second-degree murder, plus an additional 2 years for the firearm charge. The sentences would run consecutively, meaning Appling would serve the extra 2 years after completing the main term. The judge called it a fair outcome, one that recognized both the severity of the crime and Appling's willingness to accept responsibility. As the words were read aloud, there was no reaction from him. He simply nodded, eyes down, as though he had already made peace with what was coming. For the family of Clyde Edmonds, the sentence brought a small sense of closure, though it could never replace the man they lost. Some family members wept quietly in court, holding each other as the hearing ended. Others simply stared ahead, their expressions showing the exhaustion of nearly 2 years of grief and waiting. The tragedy had torn through their family and left deep scars that no amount of justice could heal. When the hearing ended, reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Cameras captured images of Appling being led away, hands cuffed, as he began the first day of what could be decades behind bars. The photos circulated across news outlets showed a man far removed from the energetic college guard who once led Michigan State's basketball team. His face was older, harder, marked by the weight of regret. It was a powerful image, one that summed up how completely his life had changed. As word spread, reactions poured in from across Detroit and beyond. Former teammates, coaches, and fans expressed sadness for everyone involved. Some spoke about how fame can vanish quickly and how difficult it is for athletes to rebuild their lives once their playing days are over. Others focused on Clyde Edmonds, remembering him as a kind, steady man whose life had ended far too soon. Across social media, messages of grief, disappointment, and reflection appeared. It was clear that this story had struck a deep chord, not just because of who Appling was, but because of how senseless the violence had been. In the months after the sentencing, life moved on in Detroit, but the memory of the case lingered. For many, it stood as a reminder of how quickly anger can destroy everything. One heated argument had erased a lifetime of hard work, love, and promise. Appling's story, once one of triumph and perseverance, had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of losing control. Inside prison, Appling began serving his sentence quietly. Reports from officials described him as cooperative and reserved. He spent much of his time alone, often reading or writing, trying to stay out of trouble. Some said he was focused on reflecting, trying to make sense of what had happened and how he could live with it. He had told his attorney that he wanted to find a way to speak to young athletes someday, to warn them about what can happen when you let anger and pride guide your actions. Whether that hope would ever come true was uncertain, but it showed that, even from behind bars, he wanted to find meaning in what was left of his life. For the Edmonds family, time brought some distance, but not full healing. They continued to honor Clyde's memory quietly, visiting his grave, sharing stories, and holding small gatherings on the anniversary of his death. They focused on forgiveness, not out of forgetfulness, but as a way to keep peace in their hearts. For them, justice had been done, but no court decision could erase the pain of losing a loved one to violence, especially when that violence came from within the family. As for the public, the story of Keith Appling became part of Detroit's complicated history, a story of potential turn to tragedy, of family ties broken by rage. It was told not as a tale of celebrity downfall, but as a human story about choice, emotion, and consequence. People remembered his rise, his fall, and the irreversible moment that ended one life and changed another forever. In the end, the case of Keith Appling was more than a crime story. It was a reflection of how fragile life can be when anger replaces reason, and how even those once admired can lose their way. It reminded everyone that success does not guarantee peace, and that in a single moment, years of effort can disappear into a decision that can never be undone. Keith Appling will serve his time, and the memory of Clyde Edmonds will remain as a symbol of what was lost. Both men's names are now tied together in one tragic chapter of Detroit's story, a chapter that began with family, erupted in violence, and ended in sorrow. In a quiet Georgia town, a split-second decision shattered 2 lives and stunned nation. He was a former NBA star. She was a devoted mother. One fatal crash on Terra Boulevard turned fame into tragedy and raised a haunting question. How does a hero become the cause of heartbreak? Jonesboro, Georgia, May 31, 2013. The day began like any other in the small southern city just south of Atlanta. It was warm, the kind of Georgia heat that clings to you, and traffic along Terra Boulevard was steady. Among the drivers that afternoon was Darren Blaylock, once a celebrated name in professional basketball. To sports fans, he was known as the tough, defensive-minded point guard who made his mark with the Atlanta Hawks. To his family and friends, he was the quiet, focused man who had built his life around the game. But that day, behind the wheel of his black Cadillac Escalade, Mookie Blaylock was far from the NBA spotlight. His career had ended years earlier, and his life had drifted into a cycle of medical problems, personal troubles, and poor choices. Blaylock was 46 at the time, living in the Atlanta area with ongoing health issues. He suffered from seizures and had been under medical care for years. Doctors had warned him not to drive because his condition could cause sudden blackouts. His driver's license had already been suspended for violations that included past DUI arrests and unpaid fines. Still, that morning, he decided to get behind the wheel and drive toward Jonesboro. His reasons for driving that day were ordinary, errands, daily routines, but what followed would turn tragic in a matter of seconds. A few miles away, a couple named Frank and Monica Murphy were driving in their Kia van. Frank, 43, was at the wheel. Monica, 40, sat in the passenger seat beside him. They were on their way through Clayton County, just outside Atlanta. The Murphys had recently returned to Georgia from Texas, where they had lived with their 5 children. That afternoon drive was supposed to be short and uneventful. Their kids were waiting for them at a nearby hotel. The couple planned to get settled and meet up with them soon after. They were laughing, talking, and thinking about the busy weekend ahead. As both cars approached each other on Terra Boulevard, the flow of traffic seemed normal. Witnesses later said Blaylock appeared to be driving at a reasonable speed before his SUV suddenly veered across the center line. There was no time to react. His vehicle swerved directly into the path of the Murphys' van. The impact was violent, a full head-on collision. The sound of metal crushing and glass shattering echoed down the road. Drivers nearby slammed on their brakes and rushed to help. When police and paramedics arrived, the scene was chaotic. The Murphy van was mangled, smoke curling from its engine. Blaylock's SUV was crushed in the front, the airbags deployed, and he was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. Emergency responders worked frantically. Monica Murphy was trapped in the passenger seat, critically injured. Her husband Frank had multiple injuries but was conscious, calling her name. Blaylock was unresponsive, later airlifted to Atlanta Medical Center and placed on life support. Frank and Monica were rushed to Southern Regional Medical Center. Despite doctors' efforts, Monica died hours later. She never regained consciousness. Frank survived, but his body was shattered, broken ribs, a fractured ankle, and deep emotional scars that would stay with him for life. The crash took from him not only his wife, but also the mother of his 5 children. As investigators pieced together the details, the case took a darker turn. Officers discovered that Blaylock's license was suspended. They also learned from medical records that his doctor had specifically told him not to drive due to his seizure disorder. He had ignored that advice. The official reports later stated that Blaylock likely blacked out behind the wheel moments before the crash, losing control of the SUV. But that medical explanation didn't erase the fact that he had made a choice to drive when he knew the risks, to take the wheel when he had no legal right to. The news spread fast. Former NBA All-Star in fatal crash was the headline everywhere. For fans who remembered his years with the Atlanta Hawks, it was shocking. Mookie Blaylock had been known as a tough competitor, a defensive specialist who led the league in steals, a man who once had his name mentioned among the elite guards of the 1990s. Now, that same name was tied to the death of a mother in Jonesboro. For Monica Murphy's family, the tragedy was unbearable. Friends described her as a kind, devoted woman who always put her family first. Frank Murphy, her husband, was left to recover from his injuries while explaining to his children that their mother was gone. Police continued their investigation over the next few weeks. Toxicology reports showed no alcohol in Blaylock's system at the time of the crash, but that didn't change the fact that he should never have been driving. He had a record of multiple traffic violations, including driving under suspension. Prosecutors began building their case for vehicular homicide. Witnesses confirmed the events leading to the collision. how the Escalade had crossed the median without warning and struck the van head-on. Mechanical failure was ruled out. The cause came down to human error, a decision made against medical and legal advice. While Blaylock lay recovering in the hospital, still facing multiple surgeries, the legal process began to move forward. The Murphy family grieved publicly, speaking to reporters about Monica's life. Her friends described her as a loving mother with a gentle heart, the kind of person who made everyone feel welcome. Frank Murphy told journalists that he forgave Blaylock but wanted justice for his wife. The story gained national attention not just because of who Blaylock was, but because of how preventable it all seemed. A once famous athlete, known for discipline and control on the court, had lost control of his life off it. Months later, as Blaylock self-stabilized, he faced formal charges: vehicular homicide, driving on a suspended license, and failure to maintain lane. Prosecutors believed the evidence was clear. He had knowingly endangered others by getting behind the wheel. The defense, however, pointed to his medical history. They argued that his blackout was caused by a seizure, something he couldn't predict or control. Yet, the prosecution countered that it wasn't the seizure that caused the tragedy, but the decision to drive despite repeated warnings not to. It was that choice that made the crash criminal. By then, Blaylock had become a symbol of a tragic fall from grace. Once cheered by thousands, he now faced the quiet judgment of a courtroom. Reporters covering the story noted his frail appearance and remorseful demeanor. He no longer looked like the athlete fans remembered, but rather a man worn down by guilt and illness. Public reaction was mixed. Some expressed sympathy, citing his medical struggles, while others saw it as a clear case of responsibility ignored. The accident left a lasting mark on the Jonesboro community. Tara Boulevard, where it happened, became a place people mentioned with sadness. Drivers who passed the intersection remembered the crash, the flashing lights, the wreckage that lingered in their minds. For the Murphy family, every mention of that road was a reminder of what they had lost. Their 5 children grew up without their mother, learning to live with the story that had taken over local headlines. As the legal case moved slowly toward trial, the facts stayed the same. Darren Mookie Blaylock, once an NBA All-Star, had crossed into oncoming traffic and caused a head-on crash that killed Monica Murphy. The question now was not what had happened, but how the law would judge it, and how the man at the center of it would live with what he had done. After the accident, the case of Darren Mookie Blaylock quickly moved from tragedy to courtroom drama. The public was fascinated not just by what had happened, but by who it happened to. This wasn't an unknown driver. It was a former NBA All-Star whose name once carried weight in sports headlines. But in 2013, Blaylock's fame couldn't protect him from the reality of what he'd done. The crash had taken a life, injured a man, and left a family broken. Now, the justice system had to determine what came next. When Blaylock regained consciousness in the hospital, he learned that Monica Murphy had died. According to those close to him, he broke down in tears when he was told. He was in pain physically and emotionally. His ribs were fractured, he had internal injuries, and the concussion left him disoriented. For weeks, he drifted in and out of recovery. But the hardest part wasn't the physical pain, it was the weight of guilt that began to sink in. Friends who visited said he was devastated. He couldn't stop replaying the crash in his mind, asking over and over how it happened so fast. Doctors told him that he had suffered a seizure before losing control of the vehicle. But deep down, he knew the truth went further than that. He wasn't supposed to be driving at all. Investigators interviewed witnesses and gathered physical evidence from the scene. Skid marks on the road showed that Blaylock's SUV had crossed the center line suddenly, without braking until the moment of impact. There was no sign of alcohol or drugs in his system, which ruled out intoxication, but police discovered a deeper issue: his driving history. Records showed a long list of violations: speeding, reckless driving, DUI arrests, and suspensions. His license had been suspended again for failing to appear in court and for unpaid fines. More troubling was the information from his doctors. Medical notes confirmed that Blaylock suffered from recurring seizures and had been told repeatedly to stop driving. His neurologist had warned him that even one episode behind the wheel could be fatal. With this evidence, prosecutors filed charges of vehicular homicide, driving on a suspended license, and failure to maintain lane. They argued that while Blaylock hadn't intended to kill anyone, his negligence and disregard for medical advice made him criminally responsible for Monica Murphy's death. In Georgia, vehicular homicide can carry a sentence of up to 15 years if the driver was operating a vehicle illegally or recklessly. The case was clear-cut in some ways, but complicated in others. It wasn't about malice or intent. It was about responsibility, and how a chain of small, avoidable decisions led to one irreversible moment. While Blaylock recovered, Frank Murphy was also going through his own painful healing process. He spent months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again after multiple surgeries. Every step reminded him of what had been lost. He was suddenly a single father of 5, trying to manage his grief while raising children who were struggling to understand why their mother wasn't coming home. Friends and community members organized fundraisers to help the family. They brought meals, donations, and support, but nothing filled the empty space Monica had left behind. Frank spoke sparingly to the media, but when he did, his words were calm and controlled. He said he didn't hate Blaylock, but wanted him to face the consequences of his choices. "You can't bring her back," he said once in an interview, "but you can admit what you did." The media followed every development. Local stations aired footage of the wreckage and clips from Blaylock's basketball career, creating a stark contrast between his past glory and his current downfall. Reporters camped outside the courthouse during hearings. The story became a reminder of how fragile success can be, how quickly a life built over decades can unravel in seconds. Fans who had admired Blaylock for his skills on the court now saw him through a different lens, a man facing a moral and legal reckoning. As the months passed, Blaylock's condition improved, but his life changed completely. His finances were strained, his career long over, and his reputation permanently damaged. He was released from the hospital and placed under strict conditions as the case advanced. Friends described him as quiet, remorseful, and deeply depressed. Some believed his medical condition had spiraled out of control. Others thought his personal habits, poor lifestyle, drinking, and lack of discipline had worsened everything. The truth likely lay somewhere in between. In court filings, the defense emphasized Blaylock's health problems. They claimed that the crash was the result of a sudden, uncontrollable medical emergency. His attorney argued that Blaylock had no intention to cause harm and that his seizures made him lose consciousness without warning. However, prosecutors countered with evidence that Blaylock had known his medical risks and ignored professional advice. His choice to drive was voluntary, they said, and that decision was enough to hold him accountable. During this period, the Murphy family continued to push for justice while trying to rebuild their lives. Frank Murphy kept a low profile, focusing on his children. Friends and relatives described how the kids often asked about their mother, and Frank struggled to find answers that made sense. The family faced birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days marked by her absence. The case dragged on, but their grief never paused. Meanwhile, Blaylock's life outside of court was quiet. He lived with family, attended medical appointments, and tried to cooperate with investigators. He avoided interviews and rarely appeared in public. When he did, he moved slowly, with a limp and a tired expression. Gone was the confident athlete who once controlled the tempo of NBA games. What remained was a man carrying the heavy weight of remorse. The turning point in the legal process came in mid-2014, when the court set a trial date. Blaylock faced the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. For months, negotiations went back and forth between his defense team and prosecutors. The defense sought a plea deal that would recognize his medical condition and allow for rehabilitation instead of extended imprisonment. Prosecutors insisted that Monica Murphy's death demanded accountability and that Blaylock's decision to drive was an act of recklessness, not an accident of fate. As the case built momentum, those who knew Blaylock personally reflected on the man they once admired. Former teammates spoke briefly to reporters, expressing sympathy but acknowledging the seriousness of the crime. They described him as quiet, disciplined, and kind, a man who never sought attention. His downfall, they said, wasn't about arrogance, but about poor judgment. It was a reminder that even the most disciplined people can lose control when their lives drift away from structure. The town of Jonesboro hadn't forgotten either. People still talked about the crash, how it happened in broad daylight, how everyone on that road that day remembered the noise and the chaos. The tragedy had left an imprint on the community. It wasn't just about fame or the law. It was about the ordinary dangers of ignoring warnings. Drivers who had once waved at Blaylock on the streets now spoke quietly when his name came up. They remembered Monica Murphy instead, the woman whose life ended so suddenly and whose family never fully healed. By late 2014, after more than a year of court appearances, medical evaluations, and delays, both sides prepared for resolution. The weight of the evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and Blaylock's own admission that he had chosen to drive despite his suspended license pointed toward one outcome. The case had begun as a shocking accident, but it evolved into a clear story of personal responsibility. It wasn't about whether Blaylock meant to cause harm. It was about the choices that made harm inevitable. As sentencing neared, public attention quieted but didn't fade. Reporters summarized the events in short headlines, but behind those lines were two families, one mourning, the other living with regret. The courtroom would soon deliver its final judgment, but the emotional verdict had already been decided. Everyone involved had lost something that couldn't be recovered. And for Mookie Blaylock, the man who once stood under bright arena lights, the next part of his story would take place under the far harsher lights of a courtroom. The courtroom in Clayton County was quiet the morning Darren Mookie Blaylock entered to face his final judgment. Nearly 2 years had passed since the crash that killed Monica Murphy, and the case had moved slowly through hearings, delays, and medical evaluations. By late 2014, both sides were ready to reach a conclusion. The man who had once played under the bright lights of NBA arenas now stood before a judge in a gray suit, thinner than before, his eyes downcast. He was no longer the athlete fans remembered. He was a man facing the consequences of a choice that changed lives forever. Prosecutors began with the facts. On May 31, 2013, Blaylock had crossed the center line on Tara Boulevard in Jonesboro, Georgia, while driving on a suspended license. His SUV collided head-on with a van driven by Frank Murphy. Monica Murphy, 40 years old, sitting in the passenger seat, was killed. Frank Murphy, 43, survived with severe injuries. There were no signs of alcohol or drugs, but Blaylock's medical condition and record told another story. His doctor had ordered him not to drive due to his recurring seizures. Yet he had ignored that warning, taken the wheel, and driven anyway. The prosecution called it negligence of the highest order, a man who knew the risks, but drove regardless. Blaylock's defense attorney spoke next. He described his client as remorseful, sick, and broken. He explained that Blaylock's health problems had worsened after his basketball career ended. Years of physical strain, head trauma, and stress had left him with a seizure disorder. The defense argued that the crash was not an act of willful disregard, but the result of an unpredictable medical episode. He did not wake up that morning intending to harm anyone, the lawyer said softly. He is a man who made a terrible mistake and will live with it for the rest of his life. They pleaded for leniency, asking the court to consider his failing health and his remorse. Frank Murphy sat quietly in the courtroom. He had waited almost 2 years for this day. The man who had killed his wife sat just a few feet away, pale and tired, no longer the confident athlete who once starred on television. Frank's face showed calm, but his eyes revealed years of pain. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and addressed the court. His voice was steady. He talked about Monica, the mother, the wife, the person whose kindness everyone remembered. He described the emptiness left behind, the birthdays and holidays without her, and the questions their children still asked. "I forgive him," Frank said, pausing for a long moment. "But forgiveness doesn't erase responsibility. My wife is gone, and that's something my children will carry forever." The courtroom fell silent. Even Blaylock seemed unable to lift his head. When the judge finally spoke, the words were direct. The court acknowledged that Blaylock hadn't intended to kill anyone, but his actions had been reckless and in violation of the law. The judge described the case as tragic from every angle: a family destroyed and a man's life ruined by his own decisions. Then came the sentence, 15 years for vehicular homicide, with only 3 years to be served in prison and the remainder on probation. It was a compromise between punishment and mercy, recognizing both his medical condition and the loss he had caused. Reporters outside the courthouse recorded every word. Headlines read, "Former NBA All-Star sentenced in fatal crash." Some said justice was served, others thought the sentence was too light. But for those directly involved, the case wasn't about years in prison. It was about accountability. Monica Murphy's family had to live with her absence. Blaylock had to live with his guilt. After sentencing, Blaylock was taken into custody to begin serving his time. His health remained fragile, and his lawyers requested medical care during incarceration. Friends described him as withdrawn, spending his days reading and reflecting. He told those close to him that he thought about the Murphys every day. He didn't seek public sympathy or media attention. For a man who once lived in the spotlight, he now preferred silence. Frank Murphy returned to his life in Georgia, raising 5 children on his own. The family leaned on each other and on the community that had supported them since the crash. Over time, they found small ways to move forward. Friends said Frank rarely talked about the trial afterward. He preferred to focus on his children's future. But the loss remained, quietly shaping every part of their lives. Each milestone, a graduation, a birthday, was bittersweet. As for Blaylock, his story became a somber lesson in the fragility of success and the consequences of negligence. During his career, he was known for control, discipline, and awareness on the basketball court. Yet off the court, a lack of control cost a woman her life. His case appeared in documentaries and articles, not for sensationalism, but because it showed how fame and fortune don't protect anyone from accountability. The same qualities that made him admired in sports, focus, determination, couldn't undo what had happened. When he was eventually released after serving his sentence, Blaylock lived quietly in Georgia. He avoided interviews and rarely appeared in public. Those who saw him said he looked older, his movements slower, his face lined with regret. There was no comeback, no public apology tour, no dramatic redemption. Just a man who had once been a star, now living with the weight of a moment that changed everything. The story of Darren Mookie Blaylock and Monica Murphy is one of tragedy, responsibility, and the high cost of ignoring warnings. It's not a story of malice or intent, but of human error and consequence. A single decision, to drive when he knew he shouldn't, set off a chain of events that ended one life and permanently altered many others. The courtroom verdict closed the legal chapter, but the emotional aftermath continues in quiet ways. A father raising his children alone, a man living with guilt, and a community that still remembers the crash on Terra Boulevard. In the end, justice was served according to the law, but there was no real victory. The sentence could not bring Monica back, and it could not erase Blaylock's remorse. It was a story that began with fame and ended with humility, a reminder that behind every headline, there are human lives forever changed by one irreversible decision. It began as a night of laughter inside a millionaire's mansion in rural New Jersey. Hours later, a man lay dead on the floor, and a former NBA star's world collapsed. What really happened behind those walls? And how did a moment of careless pride turn into a life-ending tragedy? It was a cold February night in 2002 in Alexandria Township, New Jersey. The sprawling countryside was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get in a rural corner of the state. At the top of a long private driveway sat a massive stone mansion, the home of Jason Williams, a 34-year-old retired NBA All-Star who had once been one of the most popular players on the New Jersey Nets. The estate was more than a house. It was a display of success. 40 acres of land, luxury cars in the driveway, and walls lined with basketball memorabilia. Inside, laughter echoed through the halls as Jason entertained a group of friends and guests. The night had started with drinks, stories, and easy conversation. But before sunrise, it would turn into one of the most shocking tragedies in New Jersey's sports history. That evening, Jason Williams had invited a small group of people over after attending a charity event in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The guests were a mix of friends, business acquaintances, and members of his inner circle. Among them were a few men in their 30s and 40s who knew Williams, well, people who had been part of his social circle for years. Also present was Costas Gus Christophi, a 55-year-old limousine driver who had been hired for the night to take the group back and forth safely. Christophi was known to be a quiet, hard-working man who often drove wealthy clients around the area. For him, it was just another job, a late night, a long drive, and a stop at his client's mansion before heading home. When the group arrived at the estate, the atmosphere was light. Williams was in high spirits, cracking jokes and playing host. He invited everyone inside for a tour of the house. The mansion had everything: a private bar, a basketball court, a game room, and an elaborate display of firearms that Williams collected. Guns were one of his passions, something he often showed off to friends. He enjoyed the thrill of demonstrating his shotguns, bragging about their craftsmanship and power. As the group moved from room to room, Williams decided to show off one of his favorite weapons, a 12-gauge Browning shotgun. It was sleek, heavy, and intimidating. According to later testimony, he picked it up and began explaining how it worked. Christophi, polite as always, followed the group, likely expecting the tour to end soon so he could go home. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Witnesses would later describe that Williams appeared to be joking around, showing the gun in a way that was careless. He was handling it as if it were unloaded, snapping it open and closed, spinning it in his hands like a prop. One of his guests reportedly warned him to be careful, but Williams kept demonstrating, smiling, enjoying the attention. Then, in an instant, the mood shattered. As Williams snapped the shotgun closed, a loud blast exploded through the room. The echo bounced off the walls, followed by stunned silence. The shot had hit Christophi in the chest. He collapsed instantly. Panic took over. The laughter and casual chatter turned into screams and confusion. Williams froze, staring at the man lying motionless on the floor. His friends rushed over, but it was already too late. The wound was fatal. Costas Christophi, a 55-year-old father and driver who had just been doing his job, was dead within seconds. The tragedy was overwhelming, but what happened next would make it worse. Instead of calling the police right away, Williams and several of his guests panicked. They feared what this would mean for him, a famous former athlete, a public figure with money and reputation at stake. Williams, shaken and frightened, made a terrible decision. He tried to make it look like Christophi had taken his own life. He and others reportedly wiped fingerprints off the gun and placed it near the victim's body. They rehearsed what they would tell police, trying to shape a story that sounded accidental or self-inflicted. But the cover-up didn't last long. When officers arrived, their suspicions grew immediately. The evidence didn't match the story. Investigators examined the gun, the position of the body, and the wounds. It became clear that this wasn't suicide. Christophi had been standing several feet away when the shot went off, and the angle of the blast proved he couldn't have fired it himself. The truth began to unravel quickly, and with it, Jason Williams's image of a charming, successful ex-athlete started to crumble. Word spread fast. The media descended on Alexandria Township, swarming the driveway of the mansion. Reporters from local and national outlets waited outside the gates for updates. Fans who once cheered Williams on the basketball court were now stunned by the headlines. Ex-NBA star involved in shooting death. The police began interviewing everyone present that night. Friends who had been loyal to Williams found themselves facing questions they couldn't easily avoid. The inconsistencies in their stories raised more red flags. Some of them admitted that Williams had been handling the shotgun when it discharged. Others said they were told what to say before police arrived. Bit by bit, the version of events Williams tried to control started falling apart. Meanwhile, Christophi's family was left devastated. They described him as a kind, hardworking man who never sought attention, just someone who showed up to do his job. His sister and relatives demanded answers, saying that no amount of celebrity or money should shield anyone from responsibility. Their grief turned into a fight for justice that would last for years. As the investigation continued, prosecutors charged Jason Williams with several serious offenses, including aggravated manslaughter, reckless manslaughter, and evidence tampering. The case drew national attention, not only because of Williams's fame, but also because of the strange combination of tragedy, panic, and poor judgment that surrounded it. Behind closed doors, the once charismatic athlete was now facing the reality that his life might never be the same. In public, he still smiled for cameras, but those who knew him said he was consumed by guilt and fear. He claimed the shooting was an accident, that he never meant to harm anyone. But prosecutors argued that his reckless handling of the weapon and the cover-up afterward showed otherwise. As months turned into years, the legal battle that followed became one of the most talked-about cases in New Jersey. The story captured everything that makes a true crime case so haunting: a famous figure, a senseless death, and a split-second mistake that destroyed multiple lives. By the time the trial date approached, the story had evolved from a tragic accident into a question of moral responsibility. Was Jason Williams a man haunted by a horrible mistake, or a celebrity who believed he could escape accountability? The answer would unfold in court, but the events of that night had already left their mark. The once proud home in Alexandria Township was now remembered for something darker: the place where a man lost his life in a moment of careless showmanship. The laughter and celebration that had filled those walls were replaced by silence, police tape, and a growing storm of media attention. For everyone involved, from Williams's friends to Christopher's grieving family, the night of February 14, 2002, became a line that divided life into before and after. Nothing that followed would erase what had happened inside that mansion, or the choices that came after the gun went off. The investigation into the death of Costas Gus Christopher quickly turned into one of the most talked-about criminal cases in the state. Within hours of the shooting, the New Jersey State Police arrived at Jason Williams's Alexandria Township mansion. The house, usually a symbol of his success and comfort, had become a crime scene. Officers moved through the rooms with flashlights, collecting evidence and questioning everyone who had been there that night. The guests who had once laughed and toured the house with Williams now sat pale and silent, their stories inconsistent and uneasy. Williams himself appeared shaken, but he tried to hold on to his composure. He told police that the shooting was an accident, that the shotgun had gone off unexpectedly. But the officers on scene were already skeptical. They saw signs that the group had tried to alter what happened. Fingerprints wiped off the gun, movements around the body that didn't make sense. Something about the story felt rehearsed. As investigators gathered details, they began to form a clearer picture of what happened. Williams had been showing off the shotgun, a Browning 12 gauge, to his guests in a casual but dangerous manner. He had opened and closed the weapon several times, joking about its safety features. Witnesses later testified that he even pretended to point it at people, laughing as he handled it. When the weapon discharged, it wasn't because of a malfunction or accident of mechanics. It was because of negligence. The autopsy confirmed what investigators already suspected. Christopher had been standing a few feet away when the gun fired. The angle and spread of the pellets showed he couldn't have shot himself. The shotgun blast struck his chest with enough force to kill him instantly. Christopher's family was heartbroken. He was 55, a quiet and dependable man who made his living driving others to their destinations. He didn't live in a mansion or seek fame. He simply worked hard to support those he loved. His family couldn't understand how a routine night of work had turned into his death. Their grief quickly turned into anger when they learned about the early attempts to cover up what happened. The police questioned Williams for hours. His demeanor shifted between defensive and remorseful. He repeated that it was an accident, but he also seemed deeply concerned about how it would affect his reputation. As a former NBA star, his name carried weight. He was known not just for his career on the court, but for his charity work and his charm in public appearances. But beneath that surface, there were hints of a more complicated man. one who struggled with control and impulsiveness. When the charges were officially filed, they included aggravated manslaughter, reckless manslaughter, and several counts of hindering apprehension and tampering with evidence. Williams was accused not only of causing Christopher's death through reckless behavior, but also of trying to mislead police in the aftermath. He was released on bail while awaiting trial, but his public image began to unravel. Media coverage was relentless. Every network ran footage of Williams being escorted in and out of court. Old highlights from his basketball career were replayed next to clips of the mansion and police cars. The contrast was jarring, from celebrated athlete to criminal defendant. Commentators debated whether he was a man who had made a tragic mistake or someone who believed fame could shield him from consequences. The friends who had been there that night faced their own moral struggles. Some initially tried to protect Williams, repeating the idea that the shooting was accidental and unavoidable. But as time went on, guilt and pressure began to break that loyalty. During pre-trial hearings, witnesses gave conflicting statements. Some admitted they had helped Williams clean the scene or move the gun. Others confessed they had been told what to say before police arrived. Prosecutors built their case on those inconsistencies. They argued that Williams had acted irresponsibly by playing with the gun and then compounded that recklessness by trying to stage the scene. The case wasn't about a premeditated act. It was about accountability and arrogance. They said Williams had treated a deadly weapon like a toy and then thought he could hide the truth because of who he was. Williams's defense team took a different approach. They painted him as a man devastated by an accident, someone who never intended harm. They emphasized his clean criminal record, his history of philanthropy, and his emotional breakdown after the shooting. His attorneys argued that panic and confusion led to poor decisions, not criminal intent. They reminded the jury that he had been a respected athlete, not a cold-blooded killer. The first trial began in 2004, 2 years after the shooting. The courtroom was packed every day, journalists, family members, and curious spectators all waiting to see how the story would unfold. The prosecution presented the sequence of events with precision. They called forensic experts who described how the shotgun was fired. They showed photographs from the scene and diagrams of the trajectory of the shot. The evidence made it clear that the trigger had been pulled by Williams, while Christopher stood nearby. Then came the testimony from Williams's friends. One after another, they took the stand. Their stories varied in details, but most agreed on one key point. Jason Williams had been holding the gun when it went off. Some describe how he tried to explain the gun's safety mechanism. Others recalled him joking just seconds before the blast. One witness admitted Williams told them to tell police that Christopher had shot himself. That statement carried enormous weight. The defense countered by highlighting Williams's emotional state. They argued that he was horrified by what happened and that any mistakes afterward were made in shock. They reminded the jury that Williams had immediately called for help once the group realized Christopher was dead, even if he panicked afterward. They emphasized the chaos of the moment, people screaming, blood on the floor, and a sense of disbelief. As the weeks went on, the case became less about what happened, because by then everyone knew, and more about how the law should treat it. Was it a criminal act deserving of years in prison, or an accident made worse by fear and poor judgment? The jury deliberated for days. When they returned, the verdict was mixed. They acquitted Williams of aggravated manslaughter, but couldn't reach a decision on reckless manslaughter. He was, however, convicted on 4 counts related to the cover-up and hindering the investigation. It wasn't the clean victory either side wanted. The prosecution had proven his guilt in parts, but not fully. The defense had avoided the most serious charge, but couldn't erase the damage. After the verdict, Williams stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. He looked drained. The once confident athlete now appeared as a man crushed by the weight of his own choices. He thanked his supporters, expressed sorrow for Christopher's family, and maintained that he never meant for any of it to happen. But the story didn't end there. Because the jury had deadlocked on the most significant charge, prosecutors prepared for a retrial. Williams faced the possibility of going through the entire ordeal again. His legal team tried to negotiate, hoping to find a resolution that would avoid another public spectacle. In the meantime, Williams's personal life began to spiral. The stress of the case, combined with the constant public scrutiny, took a heavy toll. While awaiting the next phase, he appeared in several interviews, often emotional and apologetic. He said he couldn't forgive himself for what happened, and that he lived with the image of Christopher's death every day. But even those interviews were met with skepticism. Some people saw them as genuine remorse. Others thought they were part of a calculated effort to gain sympathy. The case had already dragged on for years, but the tension between guilt and forgiveness only deepened. For the Christopher family, justice still felt incomplete. They believed Williams hadn't faced the full consequences of his actions. For Williams, each passing year was another reminder that fame couldn't erase the past. By the end of 2009, nearly 8 years after the shooting, both sides were exhausted, emotionally, financially, and publicly. The retrial was set to go forward, but there were quiet talks happening behind the scenes. Prosecutors wanted closure. Williams's attorneys wanted a way to end the case without risking a harsher sentence. By early 2010, the long legal battle that had followed the death of Costas Gus Christopher was nearing its end. For almost 8 years, Jason Williams had lived under the shadow of that night in his New Jersey mansion. His career, once built on fame and admiration, was now remembered through the lens of tragedy. He had gone from being an NBA All-Star with a bright smile to a man defined by guilt and reckless decision-making. The retrial for reckless manslaughter loomed, but both sides were tired. The Christopher family wanted closure, and Williams's defense team wanted to spare him another round of emotional turmoil and public humiliation. In January 2010, Williams made the decision that would finally close the case. He agreed to plead guilty to aggravated assault, admitting that his reckless handling of the shotgun had directly caused Christopher's death. The plea deal meant that the more severe charge of reckless manslaughter would be dropped, but it also meant that Williams would have to face prison time. For the first time since the shooting, he stood in court and took full responsibility for what had happened. During the plea hearing, Williams's voice was quiet and strained. He told the judge he had acted carelessly with the weapon and that he understood the pain his actions had caused. The courtroom was still as he spoke. Members of Christopher's family sat in the front row, their faces heavy with a mix of anger and exhaustion. They had waited nearly a decade for him to say the words, to acknowledge that it wasn't an accident of fate, but a deadly moment of recklessness. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was filled with cameras, reporters, and supporters. Williams wore a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him as the judge read the decision. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. The judge described the case as a tragedy born from arrogance and poor judgment. He acknowledged that Williams had shown remorse, but said that justice required accountability. As the sentence was read, Williams nodded slowly, holding back tears. Before being led away, he turned to the Christopher family and apologized directly. "There's not a day that goes by that I don't wish it was me instead," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss. I can't take it back." His words were sincere, but came years after the fact, too late to change the outcome. The sentencing marked the end of a long and painful chapter, but the story didn't fade quickly. The media revisited every detail: the night of the shooting, the trial, the failed cover-up, and the years of court battles. For the public, it was a story about how carelessness and ego could destroy 2 lives at once. The life of a hard-working man just doing his job, and the life of a famous athlete who lost everything through one impulsive act. In prison, Williams reportedly struggled with guilt and depression. Those close to him said he spent much of his time reflecting on the events that led him there. When he was finally released on parole after serving the required portion of his sentence, he spoke briefly to reporters, saying he hoped to live differently, to make peace with the family and with himself. But rebuilding his life wouldn't be simple. His name was forever tied to a man's death, and no amount of remorse could undo the consequences. For the Christopher family, the sentence was not enough to heal the loss. They remembered Gus as a quiet, kind-hearted man who didn't deserve the fate he met. Their grief remained a private burden, but they found some comfort in knowing that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. The case of Jason Williams became more than a headline. It was a cautionary story about responsibility and the dangers of recklessness. Williams had been a man who had everything: fame, wealth, admiration, and in a single careless moment he lost it all. The tragedy of that February night continued to echo through every courtroom photo, every news clip, and every public statement he made afterward. Looking back, the events that unfolded at the Alexandria Township mansion were as senseless as they were avoidable. A gun meant for display, a few reckless gestures, and a flash of overconfidence had turned into a death that could never be undone. The laughter of that evening was replaced by silence, sirens, and a lifetime of regret. Jason Williams's story stands as a haunting reminder that no amount of success can protect a person from the consequences of a single careless act. And for Costas Christophi, it's a story of an ordinary man whose life was cut short not by malice, but by another man's thoughtless mistake, one that would forever change them both.